Dear Reverend Fathers, dear Reverend Sisters, and my dear friends. St. Thomas Aquinas, a great blessing for the Church by the Lord, because whatever happened in his life is all due to the actions of the Lord himself. Because everyone who is chosen from his or her mother's womb and is planned by the Lord to achieve great things in him, achieves all of that only due to his own actions, not because of the person's greatness or his background or his culture or any other factor. It is purely the Lord who works the miracle of holiness in the life of a person. We see this happening during the times of the Old Testament as well as in the time of the Church. We see this happening in the august person of Moses, who was the first and the greatest prophet that Israel ever had. We see this happening in the lives of Samuel, in the lives of King David and King Solomon, in the life of the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, right down to our own times, through the persons of Mary, Saint Joseph, the apostles, and all the martyrs and saints that adorned the history of the Church. Among these saints, we today celebrate the feast of St. Thomas Aquinas, a great intellectual, gifted with tremendous capacity to discern the will of God for humanity. He wrote many books. He studied as a Dominican under the tutelage of St. Albert the Great, one of the great teachers of the Dominican order, who was later the Archbishop of Regensburg. He studied how to synthesize the philosophy of Aristotle with the teachings of the Lord Jesus Christ. His treatise, Summa Theologica, is a masterpiece of the synthesis between philosophical knowledge and theology. He learned how to explain the word of the Lord, word of God, in very concrete human terms in the day-to-day issues that come up in life. His methodology of posing a question, going through scriptures and the traditions of the fathers, and finally drawing conclusions or corollaries is superior to any other system of intellectual research that was found in the Church. Thus, St. Thomas Aquinas became the great teacher of the Church. He was not only just a teacher, but he was a great lover of Jesus Christ, especially the Eucharist. Some of the beautiful Eucharistic hymns that have been composed by him are being used even today. So, dear brothers and sisters, we have to praise and thank God for what he has achieved in the life of this simple man. Plato, in his philosophical presentations, showed us that there cannot be any link between the world of God and the world that is phenomenal in this real situation of our life. He said there is no possibility for the two to interact. But Jesus Christ came on earth to show that it is possible for God to intervene in the life of human beings. And therefore his incarnation became the highest manifestation of God becoming a human being. St. Thomas Aquinas, following the philosophy of Aristotle in a more pragmatic and practical way, showed us how divine science can be reconciled with human philosophy and human achievements. Therefore, it is a beautiful life of a person who loved God deeply and who developed systems to understand human knowledge and human wisdom. The Holy Father, Pope Francis, if we compare Pope Francis with Pope Benedict, we have here two persons who reflect in a very comprehensive manner the theology of Plato and Aristotle, the idea of God in Plato and in Aristotle. Pope Benedict reflects a situation where he says that it is the Lord who will have to save us. The Lord takes the initiative. And Pope Francis is a person who says, yes, the Lord takes the initiative, but you have to cooperate. You have to do your own part. And that is why he is seeking today to bring the Church closer and closer to the realisms of human life. And he wants us as Christians to follow the principle of do and let it be done. So, my dear brothers and sisters, he has called upon all educational institutions, including university colleges, including schools, and all Catholic educational institutions, to seek to serve society without any discrimination, without any difference, calling upon them to serve all humanity, to be open to all members of religions, different philosophies. His Holiness shows us the way to be more incarnated into human reality, Pope Francis. In fact, one of his documents fascinated me is Fratelli Tutti, all are brothers and sisters in this planet. The Holy Father says, some people attempt to flee from reality, taking refuge in their own little world. Others react to it with destructive violence. Yet between selfish indifference and violent protest, there is always another possible option open, that of dialogue. Dialogue between generations, dialogue among our people, for we are that people. Readiness to give and receive while remaining open to the truth. A country flourishes when constructive dialogue occurs between its many rich cultural components: popular culture, university culture, youth culture, artistic culture, technological culture, economic culture, and media culture. He says this in Fratelli Tutti number 199. Lack of dialogue means that in these individual sectors, people are not concerned for the common good, but for the benefits of power, or at least for ways to impose their own will on the others. Round tables taken thus become initiatives for negotiating sessions, in which individuals attempt to seize even possible advantage rather than cooperating in the pursuit of the common good. The heroes of the future will be those who break with this unhealthy mindset and determine respectfully to promote truthfulness aside from personal interest. The Holy Father is asking us to leave behind whatever is our own in order to reach out to the others. If that kind of break cannot happen, that kind of openness that will heal society will never happen. God willing, such heroes, those who work to break ties with their unhealthy mindset, are quickly emerging even now in the midst of our society. All this calls for the ability to recognize other people's right to be themselves and to be different. We cannot have a monolithic society anywhere because we have such a variety of differences. Differences not only at the religious level, differences at the level of philosophy, differences at the level of politics, differences at the level of equality, differences at the level of education. All these differences have to be given up in order to create a unified world. The Holy Father's intent in writing this apostolic exhortation is to encourage human beings to go for a united one world project. So the Holy Father says, all this calls for the ability to recognize other people's right to be themselves and to be different. This recognition, as it becomes a culture, makes possible the creation of a social covenant. Without it, subtle ways can be found to make others insignificant and irrelevant, if no value to society, while rejecting certain visible forms of violence. Another, more insidious kind of violence can take root: the violence of those who despise people who are different. You can see that happening in our own culture, in our own country. People are so nervous today. If we talk about reconciliation, if we talk about accountability, if we talk about transparency, people are so nervous today that they think that they can protect themselves inside parapet walls. The Holy Father says that we must never encourage parapet walls between us. We must break down all parapet walls. The Catholic educational system, whether it is in the school or in the university college, should open its doors to all kinds of people and teach them how to seek unity among each other and not to find only the differences. If a human being cannot tolerate differences in other people, then he is no more a human being. If he thinks that he can hide inside a shell and protect himself from the others, cut off from them totally, he loses his humanity. He saw her humanity. The Holy Father says, when one part of society exploits all that the world has to offer, acting as if the poor did not exist, then there will eventually be consequences. Sooner or later, ignoring the existence of and rights of others will erupt in some form of violence. We saw this happening in the 1960s, 70s, and more intensely in the 1980s and 90s, which cost us a whole lot of human lives in that senseless, meaningless war that our leaders led our country into. It is true that we are a country with a unique history, unique traditions and culture. But this is also enriched through the mixture with other cultures, other peoples who walked into this country in its history. So therefore, to create a monolithic structure, since 1956, that monolithism started spoiling our society, showing that we have to be only people of one language or one religion. This cannot be tolerated. This will never bring human beings together. It will only create walls between human beings. What we need is a social covenant. It must be a cultural covenant which accepts different worldviews, different lifestyles as part of a coexistence in our human life. Peace in a society cannot be understood as pacification or the mere absence of violence resulting from the domination of one part of society over others, says the Pope. Demands involving the distribution of wealth, concern for the poor, and human rights cannot be suppressed under the guise of creating a consensus on paper or a transient peace for a contextual minority. The dignity of the human person and the common good rank higher than the comfort of those who refuse to renounce their privileges. When these values are threatened, a prophetic voice must be raised. That is the role of the Catholic Church today in this country, to raise our voices and clamor against discrimination, against violence, against hatefulness, against separatism, against separation between races, religions, and society. When Sri Lanka gained independence in 1948, Singapore also gained independence, more or less at the same time. Then an intelligent ruler who guided the destinies of Singapore decided that one of the most important things that must be done if Singapore is to progress, one has to ensure that the three major communities intermingled in fairness to each other, with due respect and reverence to each other. That is, the Chinese, the Indians, and the Malays who were living there. So he created immediately, one of his first priorities was to create a non-discrimination law in that country that helped to galvanize the three communities together. Having done that, then he embarked on his economic plan. But what our leaders did by 1956 was to create division among us, division among the Sinhalese and the Tamils, and to create an unnecessary struggle that ended in battle and war on the field of war. And thousands of young lives were lost, whether those lives belong to the army, the navy and the air force, or the police, and whether they belong to the LTTE cadres. They are all young lives that would have helped this country to develop. Our leaders made the foolish mistake of separating and trying to get votes on the basis of communalism as their platform. Starting in 1956, this became more and more intense as time went by. By 1978, we had a constitution imposed on us by some people who did not promise that they were representing us to vote for such a constitution. And that constitution was approved, and that constitution became a monster, whereby gradually the rule of law was destroyed in this country. While in Singapore, every act of violence or every act against the rules was punished by the courts, which were supremely independent, in Sri Lanka, the government rulers started interfering with the judiciary with all kinds of laws and clauses and amendments to the constitution. That continued, so that by now today, even the judgments of the Supreme Court are not regarded at all by our rulers in this country. So there is no rule of law in this country. Whereas in Singapore, if you break the law, you may be the Prime Minister, you may be the President. If your car goes at a certain speed and you are stopped, you have to pay the damages. You can't avoid it because you are a minister or you are a government person. Today, there are several people who are in jail for acts of dishonesty with regard to medical supplies. But the man who ordered those transactions is going about free because he is a minister. That's the way the country's laws have been applied after independence, unlike in Singapore. Finally, this country has ended in disaster because of severe corruption. If any minister was found corrupt in Singapore, he was required to resign immediately. Even recently, one of the ministers announced his resignation over just a charge that was made against him of dishonesty. But our people have been robbing and stealing and taking bribes in royal style, and they have never been punished. This is what happened to our independent country, Sri Lanka. After 75 years, Singapore is flourishing as one of the highest and the most respected countries in the East, whereas Sri Lanka is languishing at the very bottom. The Sri Lankan passport is not respected in many countries, whereas the Singapore passport is respected. Wake up, citizens of Sri Lanka. What are you doing? Is the question that we have to ask. Do you want to continue with this terrible situation? Or do you want to cast that vote in such a way that this country will emancipate itself and have a new beginning? That is your choice. If you do not do that, this country will end in total disaster. Violence, street fights, murders, and these things are slowly beginning to happen. Let us hope that our beautiful countries, one of the most beautiful countries that we could ever have inherited, this beautiful country will be destroyed if we don't act fast. And we have to be courageous before, as the Holy Father says, in the light of the Gospels, wisdom should encourage us to be courageous, not to funk, not to hide, not to say, well, it will cost me, it will mean difficulties, pain, perhaps even death. It doesn't matter. We have to be courageous. We have to say how things are and call for a change of our society. Institutions like Aquinas College, where children or youth of all kinds of religions and social backgrounds come for their higher education. These values must be taught to them. Otherwise, there is no point in the Catholic Church running these institutions, because these institutions are not for the Catholic Church to make money, but for the Catholic Church to serve the youth so that the youth learn to respect each other, to grow into a culture of unity and respect for each other, to accept differences. As the Holy Father says, we cannot create a united world today, as the Holy Father wants to create a united world on the basis that we are all brothers and sisters, fratelli tutti. We cannot achieve that if we allow this kind of divisiveness, this kind of situation to continue. Politicians used our differences to come to power. In all the elections that were conducted in the past 75 years, many a time our leaders harped on the differences between the Sinhalese and the Tamils and tried to bring the communal flag on top in order to get the votes. In one of the last elections, the communal flag was against the Muslims. The Muslims are a serious threat to our society. Therefore, let us cast our vote for a very truly nationalist Sinhalese leader. That was the platform. In order to make that platform solid, they killed 273 people in the Easter Sunday bomb attacks to show how brutal the Muslims can be. But we know that it is not only the Muslims who are responsible for those murders, but there were others also, highly placed officials of the government involved in this plot. We want a transparent investigation if we want to know the truth, so that our society may flourish thereafter in the light of that truth that we discover. The Holy Father says, unless we recover the shared passion to create a community of belonging and solidarity worthy of our time, our energy and our resources, the global illusion that misled us will collapse and leave many in the cries of anguish and emptiness. Therefore, he calls upon us not to create walls. Paradoxically, he says, we have certain ancestral fears. We have ancestral fears that technological development has not succeeded in eliminating. Indeed, those fears have been able to hide and spread behind new technologies. Today, too, outside the ancient town walls lies the abyss, the territory of the unknown, unfamiliar, not part of the village. It is the territory of the barbarian. when you consider the other a barbarian, from whom we must defend ourselves at all costs. As a result, new walls are erected for self-preservation. The outside world ceases to exist and leaves only my world, to the point that others no longer are considered human beings possessed of an inalienable dignity. They become part of them. This is what happens, for example, happened in Israel when Ariel Sharon, one of the presidents, decided to erect walls separating the same little town into two sectors, the Arabic sector and the Jewish sector, thereby separating people. What happens? You create enclaves of loneliness for people. You create artificial barriers between people. If people interact, they may find that each other, in the interaction of each other, they may find so many riches that they have not been able to get if walls separated them. In Sri Lanka also, we people have walls created between us. Break down these walls, says the Holy Father, and you will find happiness for good. Let us now think of that very seriously and pray for our country. It's in a serious crisis, much more than we can even think of. Many of us like to be like people who consume drugs. Once you are drugged, you don't have thoughts on what can happen to you. You are in an artificial, synthetic world. That is why people who take drugs fly from buildings, thinking that they can fly. But we know the realistic world is different from what you create like that. When you are drugged by the rulers with grants and with help and with positions and with participation in your ceremonies and all that, then you feel drugged by them. If you want to create a new Sri Lanka, we must not go after these people. We must stand on our own feet as human beings and help to build a new Sri Lanka for tomorrow. The Holy Father wants us to be open to all other religions and races. Thus, we would like to make these institutions like Aquinas, the BCI, some of the leading colleges and convents that are run by us to become fonts of unity between human beings of different races and religions. May Sri Lanka flourish in the unity of its people. Amen.